Good morning.
Good morning.
It's still morning. It's not noon yet. So we have a great pleasure today to have with us Dr. Wil Burns, who is a visiting professor at the program in Environment and Culture at Northwestern University. And he flew in this morning to be with us and talk about carbon removal. And as you all know, there isn't much I should be saying you because you all know that we are all looking to do both adaptation and mitigation when it comes to climate change. And sequestering carbon is a huge part of the equation of getting to net zero. So Professor Wil Burns will be talking about that. You've all probably read his bio that's available online, and you know what he has done. He has been teaching in several places. He got his Ph.D. in Wales and Cardiff University. So that's part of the European part. And we have Gina, who got her PhD in Oxford, in Europe too. So it's glad to have you with us today. He also taught in Boston, in UC Berkeley, you were in Wyoming, and he has been in DC. He's the co-director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University. And we are so happy to have Wil with us today, and you feel free to add more. I just shortened your bio.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Well, it's a miracle on a Friday, especially before spring break, that anybody's here. So I thank you for indulging me, and hopefully you won't regret it. As all of you know, only too well, the Paris Climate Agreement establishes the salutary objectives of trying to hold temperatures to quote unquote well below 2 degrees Celsius and at least aspirationally to 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, as we also know, there is a yawning gap between the pledges that countries have made under the Paris Agreement, the so-called nationally determined contributions, and what would be necessary to achieve those goals. So as a consequence, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its 6th report, has said that even under an intermediate scenario, and we're not even at that scenario yet, temperatures rise about 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And in a high emissions scenario, possibly as much as 4.4 degrees, right? And we also know that if we get temperature increases of this magnitude, that it's going to be, hold on, the course have stopped working. Let's see. I'll go use it this way, that we get potentially catastrophic implications in terms of human institutions as well as ecosystems. Temperatures rise 3 degrees Celsius. We melt the Greenland ice cap. Melting of that ice cap alone ultimately results in about 1,000 years in about 20 feet of sea level rise. Temperatures rise between 1.7 and 2 degrees Celsius. We lose most of the world's coral reefs, which provide critical sustenance for about 1/4 of all species in the oceans. Temperature increases of between 2 to 3 degrees Celsius has huge other biodiversity impacts, as well as impacts in terms of human health, increases in violent weather events, and so forth. And so it is probably not surprising that as a consequence of our inability to get our act together in terms of traditional mitigation, we have started looking at so-called carbon dioxide removal approaches as a supplementary approach to help save the world's bacon. And this is a definition of carbon dioxide removal. So anthropogenic human activities that seek to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs, or to utilize this CO2 in products. So when we talk about carbon dioxide removal, given the burgeoning greenhouse gas emissions and our historical emissions, we're now looking at CDR to be deployed at an extremely large scale. Recent studies have indicated that by the end of the century, we will probably have to be removing somewhere between 13 to 20 gigatons, that is billion tons of carbon dioxide annually, and maybe as much as 10 gigatons by 2050. To put that in perspective, we at this time are only sequestering about 0.1 gigatons a year. So we have an incredible task ahead. Now, up until a couple years ago, most of the focus in terms of carbon removal was on so-called terrestrial options. This includes things like planting forests, enhancing soil sequestration, direct air capture facilities. But increasingly, there's been an acknowledgement that a lot of these approaches at a very large scale could prove unsustainable, or they could prove economically untenable. And as a consequence, we've started talking more and more of putting together a portfolio of carbon removal responses, which include a role for the world's oceans. And this is logical in many ways, because if you look at the world's oceans, they currently take up about a third of all of the carbon dioxide that we release into the atmosphere annually, and they store about 10 times more CO2 than we find in terrestrial sinks. And so what I want to do today is look at some of the primary carbon removal options that are marine-based, look at their potential benefits, look at their potential risks, and then after that, given the fact that many of these approaches could have a profound impact either extraterritorially or in terms of the global commons, I want to talk a bit about what governance looks like this, both in terms of institutions that have already sought to assert jurisdiction of these approaches and others that might do so in the future. So we're going to work through a number of marine-based CDR options. And we'll go through them fairly quickly, but try to talk about benefits and risks in each case. So we start off with
I guess the cable came out. Okay.
all right. Talking about technology, ironically enough. So the first of these that we talk about is ocean iron fertilization. And the essence of understanding ocean iron fertilization is understanding the role of phytoplankton, right? These single-celled organisms in the world's oceans. Now, phytoplankton take up carbon dioxide, and they use it in the photosynthetic process, much as terrestrial plants do. And indeed, about half of all of the photosynthesis on Earth occurs in the world's oceans in terms of phytoplankton. Now, when phytoplankton take up CO2, almost all of that CO2 is immediately released again at surface, either by remineralization in terms of bacteria or by consumption of higher order species. However, a small portion of that CO2 stays with these species when they drop below the photic or light layer. And ultimately, those phytoplankton, when they end up in the sediment, can result in long-term storage, as much as a century or perhaps a few centuries of storage of that CO2, right? And we call this process the ocean's biological pump. Now, the ocean's biological pump is certainly substantial at this point, but proponents of ocean iron fertilization argue that we could put the biological pump on steroids through the process of ocean iron fertilization. What they argue is that there are certain areas of the world's oceans, and these are predominantly in the Antarctic region or the Southern Ocean, that have an optimal level of critical macronutrients for phytoplankton production, that being phosphorus and nitrogen, but they have a shortage of a critical micronutrient, and that micronutrient is iron. And so the proposals for ocean iron fertilization is to dump large amounts of iron filings into these areas to try to stimulate phytoplankton production. The idea is that if phytoplankton take up more CO2 and sequester that CO2, it will ultimately result in a drawdown of CO2 from the atmosphere. The reason is that CO2 in the atmosphere and in the ocean are in equilibrium. And so if you remove more CO2 from the world's oceans, more CO2 from the atmosphere can enter into the oceans, and it results in a net drawdown in atmospheric concentrations of CO2. And that's the idea behind ocean iron fertilization. Now, when ocean iron fertilization was first being looked at in labs and models about a decade ago, people were extremely optimistic about this approach. One study concluded that it could sequester as much as 25% of all of this carbon dioxide found in the atmosphere. It was also deemed to be extremely cheap. It was estimated that this approach could potentially be done for somewhere between $5 to $10 per ton. Right? So all good. However, we've had a moment of reckoning when it comes to ocean iron fertilization. In the last couple of decades, there's been 13 experiments where we've in a small area, we've seeded the world's oceans with iron to see what would happen. And so that's the first question. Based on that evidence, do we think ocean iron fertilization would be effective? Well, one of the things that we see is that when we do seed areas with iron, we do see proliferation of phytoplankton almost immediately, right? And we start to see uptake of carbon dioxide, right? That's the good news, okay? But as we talked about in terms of the biological pump, this approach does not work unless the phytoplankton fall below the photic layer, the light layer, and bring that CO2 ultimately to the bottom of the oceans where it can be buried in sediments. If it's released before it gets past that light layer, you're not going to get any sequestration. And what we've seen in virtually all of these studies is this does not happen, right? Most of these phytoplankton, when they start to proliferate, essentially create a gigantic sushi bar, right? And zooplankton come into the area and start consuming that phytoplankton, and it results in releases of most of the carbon dioxide that we're talking about before it drops below the photic layer. And indeed, of the 13 studies that have been done to date, the field studies, only one of them showed substantial amounts of sequestration of CO2 below that photic layer. And so as a consequence, the estimates of what we would get in terms of ocean iron fertilization effectiveness have begun to substantially decline. One recent study said that instead of being able to sequester 25% of all the CO2 in the atmosphere, maybe 10%. Another study said maybe 5%. Some recent studies have said maybe 2%, right? And so it's not likely that we get anywhere near the estimates that we thought when we were looking purely at modeling. So that's one issue in this context. A second question is, are there risks associated with dumping large amounts of iron in sensitive ocean ecosystems, right? You can probably guess that the answer is yes, okay? And this is on a number of different scales, okay? So the first issue that we have is that if you're successful in producing large amounts of phytoplankton, right? It's not like when you go to Macy's to buy a pair of socks and you get to pick exactly the color and size you want. You get what you get, right? And one of the things that ocean scientists are afraid of is that we might see proliferation of certain kinds of phytoplankton that wouldn't be palatable to zooplankton in the area, right? And we could get a biological trophic cascade, right? Where the decrease in zooplankton in turn has a knockoff effect on species that consume the zooplankton, including marine mammals, for example. And we have some empirical evidence of this. In one experiment in the Indian Ocean, we saw a proliferation of one kind of phytoplankton species called Phaeocystis antarctica, and it outcompeted other phytoplankton in the area, but it turned out that the zooplankton in the area didn't want to eat it, right? Didn't matter because we had only seeded 100 kilometer by 100 kilometer area and we stopped, right? But if we had done this on a basin-wide scale, right, we could have had potential to wreak havoc with this ocean ecosystem, right? So that's one thing that we're worried about is a proliferation of phytoplankton that we don't want. A second issue that we're worried about in this context is something called nutrient robbing. So if you get a proliferation of phytoplankton, they are going to take up more macronutrients at the same time, right? And the problem with that is that traditionally, most of those macronutrients, for example, in the Southern Ocean, ultimately end up in an area 30 degrees south and more north and those macronutrients drift into areas that support incredibly lucrative fisheries, right? And the worry that we have is that that no longer would happen, and it could wreak havoc with fisheries that are critical both for subsistence for many populations as well as providing economic benefits in those areas. It could also obviously create huge sort of geostrategic tensions, right? If ultimately you start to see economic knockoff effects from nutrient robbing in these regions. Okay. The last thing that we worry about, of course, is eutrophication, right? In any case where you get widespread proliferation of algae, for example, you can ultimately have massive die-offs of species and so-called red tides, as we've seen in the past in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and effects of this sort. So as a consequence of all of this, ocean iron fertilization is not considered quite as dreamy as we originally thought, right? Proponents, on the other hand, still argue that what we need are longer-term studies in more areas, right, to try to assess ultimately the effectiveness, right? They say that even if ultimately this approach could only sequester 5 or 10% of the CO2, it might make sense, right, from a standpoint of cobbling together a number of carbon removal approaches to ultimately get to that number of 15 to 20 gigatons. And so there is some impetus to begin research again in places such as off the coast of South Korea. All right. Second approach that we look at is something called ocean alkalinity enhancement, or OAE. So when carbon dioxide is taken up in the oceans, it reacts with water and it forms carbonic acid. This acid in turn dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. Over time, calcifying organisms convert the bicarbonate ions into calcium carbonate, right? And they use it for shell building. And ultimately then, when those species die, drop to the bottom of the ocean and are sequestered in sediments, they've taken substantial amounts of carbon dioxide with them, right? And so this creates that same kind of atmospheric drawdown, right? The concentrations of CO2 decline as a consequence of this process, and that allows more CO2 from the atmosphere to enter the world's oceans. The problem is, as the amount of CO2 in the oceans has increased, it's resulted in a saturation of CO2 that has slowed this process down. And so the idea of ocean alkalinity enhancement is adding alkalinity to the world's oceans, right? And as you can see here, the theory is that when these alkaline substances, and this can include things like olivine, magnesium hydroxide, any material that is rich in silicates and magnesium, that when we introduce those, the hydrogen ions are produced and they react with CO2, and that ultimately produces bicarbonates, right? And so again, you get a massive increase in bicarbonates that can be taken up by species, converted to calcium carbonates, and ultimately it converts CO2 and allows more CO2 to enter from the atmosphere. Okay. As I said, we've talked about a number of materials: olivine, wollastonite, basalt, magnesium hydrates, or perhaps lime could be added in the system. And there's some variants of this system. There's an geochemical approach that would ultimately seek to either add alkalinity through that process or strip CO2 out through that process. Now, a couple of questions here is, first of all, whether this would be effective. And the studies are all over the board. Some studies have indicated that at most, this could draw down concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, which are about 419, 420 right now, by about 30 parts per million, right? Which by the end of the century, when we anticipate the concentrations may be double what they are now, would be fairly de minimis. On the other hand, Some studies indicate that it could draw down CO2 at levels of 160 to 450 parts per million, right? Which would be terribly substantial. But of course, when you have error bars of that magnitude, right, you know that a lot more research needs to be done. And again, most of what we've done to date has been modeling. And the argument is that we need substantial amounts of field studies to try to determine if this approach can ultimately be effective. There's also risks of introducing large additional amounts of alkalinity into the ocean. One risk is that it could disadvantage some species that cannot exist in a more high alkaline environment, right? That have a delicate balance that could ultimately be denuded in this case. And we've seen this already in some of the modeling and some of the modest field experiments that species such as littoral crabs, for example, could be disadvantaged if we increased alkalinity substantially, and especially if we increased it very quickly, right? And did not give them an ability to adjust. A second issue associated with introducing alkalinity is that you can have lots of toxic heavy metals introduced into the marine environment. This can include things such as cadmium, nickel, and chromium, right? A lot of it is dependent on the kind of materials that you're using. And so one of the things that research is looking at is, are there certain minerals that are both effective and at the same time do not release substantial amounts of heavy metals? The good news is that some of the preliminary research that's been done by some startup companies in limited areas so far have indicated that at least in terms of nickel and chromium, the levels that they're seeing after these experiments are lower than those that reach toxic thresholds, right? But again, we're going to need more research and on a larger scale than we've seen at this point. We also think that there could be biogeochemical implications of increasing alkalinity. One recent study said that adding calcium oxide changed the timing of phytoplankton blooms, right? And that ultimately could have huge implications in terms of a mismatch between when these blooms occur and the species that rely upon them. Okay, so ocean alkalinity enhancement. Third approach that we're looking at, ocean upwelling or downwelling. We're going to focus on upwelling. And upwelling is an easy one to understand because we've already talked about ocean iron fertilization. The idea of ocean upwelling is to draw nutrient-rich materials from the bottom of the ocean, utilizing things such as pumps of various sorts or pipes, and draw those nutrient-rich resources to the top of the ocean, where it would ultimately increase nutrients for phytoplankton, in turn increasing phytoplankton production and amping up that biological pump that we talked about, right? That's the idea behind ocean upwelling. But there are lots of questions about ocean upwelling. One, again, is in terms of its effectiveness. One recent study has indicated that it may at most effectuate a gigaton of CO2 removal annually, and some studies see much less, right? Proponents argue that, again, if we could get a gigaton of this, right, and we could get a 15th to a 20th of all the CO2 removal we need, it might be worth looking at this approach and cobbling it together with all these others in this portfolio. But more research needs to be done. There's also risks associated with this intervention, and this is on a number of different axes. First of all, there's some evidence that this could substantially restructure ocean ecosystems. It could ultimately privilege large phytoplankton, such as diatoms, right? And that ultimately could change the nature of these ecosystems that are often in a delicate balance and may have a knockoff effect, especially in terms of fisheries. And so there's some research that's being looked at in this case. We also think that paradoxically, this could exacerbate warming, okay? And that's true for two reasons. First of all, one of the things beyond getting lots of nutrients from the bottom of the ocean is that these areas are often rich in CO2, right? And so ultimately you may draw up large amounts of CO2 to the top of the ocean surfaces and outgas that CO2 into the atmosphere, right? Which would defeat the very purpose that you're trying to do. There's also some evidence that this approach could ultimately reduce clouds and sea ice, and it could result in a decrease in outward long wave radiation being released, which again could exert a warming impact. So a lot more research needs to be done in that context. One more. And this is seaweed farming or macro algae cultivation. So wild seaweed have been removing carbon dioxide through the photosynthetic process again for at least 500 million years. And a recent study has said that natural seaweed ultimately removes about 173 million metric tons of carbon dioxide annually from the atmosphere. So the idea of macroalgae farming is fairly simple. You want to plant a lot more macroalgae in the world's oceans to take up CO2, and then you want to sink that macroalgae after it's taken up that CO2 to the bottom of the oceans and get storage for hundreds or thousands of years in terms of that carbon dioxide, right? And so you have a number of companies that are already working on this. There's a company in Maine, for example, called Running Tide, and their idea is to spray buoys, right? And a huge number of buoys they contemplate, potentially millions of buoys, ultimately with macroalgae. And when those macroalgae reached a certain weight, the buoys would drop to the bottom of the ocean. And in theory, it would take large amounts of CO2 with it. Okay, this company, Running Tide, has estimated that gigatons, multi-gigatons of CO2 could ultimately be sequestered through this approach. Okay. Question, first of all, again, is whether this would be effective, right? So despite the fact that some of these private companies are talking about huge multi-gigaton sort of effectiveness, some of the science in recent years has indicated that may not be true. The National Academy of Science, which did a very large study of marine-based carbon dioxide removal approaches a couple of years ago, concluded that at most, this approach at a very large scale, and we'll talk about what large scale means in a second, could sequester about a third of a gigaton annually, right? And so once you start getting below the gigaton level, you have to start worrying about whether these approaches can make sense from a cost-benefit analysis, right? And also, when we talk about getting that third of a gigaton, according to the National Academy of Science, it would require a 100-meter strip of macroalgae in all of the 60% of coastlines globally where macroalgae could be planted. Okay, so you think about what the potential interference with fisheries, tourism, other kinds of things, and you know it's just not going to be practical that you're going to put a 100-meter strip of macroalgae in every part of the world where you could possibly do it, right? Proponents, on the other hand, say you don't have to be just looking at coastal areas, right? You can put macroalgae out in the open oceans, and that would massively increase the amount of areas where you could do it, and thus massively potentially increase the amount of sequestration that could be effectuated. The problem is that when you get out into the open oceans, first of all, it's much more expensive to do this approach from a standpoint of monitoring, from a standpoint of ultimately creating these facilities. And it's much more difficult to monitor ultimately what's happening. But that may be the only way that this approach could have a lot of impact. Despite the fact that people like to claim that things like this are natural, right? And thus benign, right? The lesson that we've seen when we've looked at terrestrial-based carbon removal is that anything at massive scales no longer is benign, right? If you're talking about tree planting, which sounds virtuous, and all of a sudden you do it on 900 million hectares of land, which is what some people have been proposed, you start to see all kinds of negative impacts, right? In terms of losses of prairie grasslands, savannas, expelling people from their livelihoods. The same is also true in the world's oceans, if you expand these things to massive scales, right? So one of the things that we know is that if we started planting huge amounts of macroalgae, it would start to compete with phytoplankton for nutrients, right? And we know phytoplankton are critical in terms of the food chain, and also phytoplankton are critical in terms of CO2 sequestration, right? So how much of a knockoff effect would it have in terms of essentially robbing nutrients from phytoplankton? According to a study that was released a couple of months ago, according to a study released a couple of months ago, it was estimated that it could ultimately reduce the amount of phytoplankton by a fifth by the year 2100 and 60% by the year 3000. Right. So there are incredible trade-offs between these approaches, right? And that would ultimately have to be taken into account, right, in terms of negative impacts in terms of ecosystems, as well as sequestration if we lose that amount of phytoplankton. Other risks associated with this: entanglement, right, of species, right? All of a sudden you're putting a couple million buoys with ropes on, right, into the oceans, right? What's the worst thing that could happen? Lots of bad things, right? And so that would have to be taken into account in terms of where these were ultimately placed and how they were monitored. Another risk are invasive species, right? It's been estimated that on some of these buoys that these companies have been putting out for tests, you can have thousands of species that hitch a ride on these buoys, right? And these buoys move, right? And so ultimately you could be introducing large amounts of invasive species into other exclusive economic zones or into open ocean ecosystems where they did not exist before, right? And again, additional research would be critical in this context. The last thing that we worry about is what's the impact on benthic or deep ocean organisms when you all of a sudden start dropping huge amounts of biomass on them, right? And that's by no means clear, right? And our understanding of benthic organisms is lower than our understanding of what's happening on the moon. It's always been true. It remains the same. And so at any time I hear claims, well, there's nothing in this area, we just absolutely know that, right? So there's no risk associated with it. I know that that is a company that is BSing me, okay? And then overall, all of these approaches, one major challenge we have is what we call MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, right? In virtually all these cases, who's driving this are companies, right, that are ultimately going to want to sell carbon credits, right? So they have to be able to quantify how much CO2 is being sequestered in the process. The problem is that is very difficult in many cases. For example, when you look at ocean alkalinity enhancement, the air-sea flux exchange, where all of a sudden you see decreases in the concentrations of CO2 in the ocean and uptake from the atmosphere, that air-sea flux can occur hundreds of miles from where you've ultimately put this alkalinity, right? And it's subject to huge amounts of noise in that environment, right? And so how do you separate out what may have happened in that system and attribute it to an intervention that's hundreds of miles away? It could also occur many years after you initially intervened, right? And so MRV is a challenge, not only for ocean alkalinity enhancement, but for virtually all of these, right? And if you're going to monetize this, and you're going to claim, for example, as a company that you're reaching net zero emissions, right? By balancing your emissions with these sequestrations, we want to make sure that we get this right, right? And this system at this point is probably not fit for prime time. All right. So if we decide that we're going to research these approaches and potentially deploy these approaches at a large scale, how do we govern it, right? Given the fact that, as we've seen, there are huge potential transboundary sort of implications. Well, to date, we've had two treaty regimes that have already sought to try to regulate some of these approaches, okay? So the first of them is a treaty called the London Convention. So the London Convention was created in the 1970s. It was created to prevent harms from dumping materials into the world's oceans. Well, in 2007, 2008, the London Convention became very concerned because you started having companies that were claiming that they were going to go out, dump iron into the oceans, and then sell carbon removal credits, right? And this regime was concerned that that approach would ultimately have negative impacts on ocean ecosystems, right? And so they passed a resolution to address that. And it was a bit of a good news, bad news story if you were a company in the ocean iron fertilization business. The good news is they said an exception to the dumping provisions of the treaty apply. Okay, the treaty provides that that putting materials in the ocean for a purpose other than mere disposition, meaning that you're trying to throw it away. If you're putting those materials in the ocean for a purpose other than that, it does not constitute dumping. And so you don't need a dumping permit to do it, right? As long as it comports with the rest of the provisions of the treaty, okay? So what they said, the bad news side though, for these companies was, we're really afraid of the implications of dumping iron in the oceans. We don't know much about it. We don't have governance, right? And so we're only going to allow you to do it if it's for scientific research purposes only, okay? So no selling carbon credits or any of these activities, small scale and subject to risk assessment, right? And the risk assessment would then have to be signed off on by the government that has jurisdiction over the project, right? So in other words, a vessel, if it's flagged in the United States, for example, the US government would have to sign off on a risk assessment that this experiment was acceptable, right? And they subsequently, in 2010, established a risk assessment framework. And any of you that have had risk assessment before can see it's a standard assessment process. Okay, so that's what the London Convention did. Now, this approach has some real limitations from a standpoint of regulating marine-based carbon removal approaches. Okay, first of all, the resolutions that they pass in the London Convention are not legally binding on the parties. Okay, now most of the parties adhere to most of the provisions of most of the resolutions most of the time. Okay, but they don't have to. Okay, so that's one issue, right? It's a non-legally binding suggestion of what they should do. Second of all, the resolution was focused on ocean iron fertilization, right? So it would not, by definition, encompass regulation of ocean alkalinity enhancement, upwelling, any of these other approaches, right? And in fact, upwelling probably doesn't get regulated at all, right? Because this treaty focuses on putting things into the ocean, right? Upwelling doesn't put anything new in the ocean, right? As long as you remove the pipes at the end, right? It simply redistributes things in the ocean, right? But the other approaches also would not be regulated. It's focused on ocean iron fertilization. So that's a major limitation, right? Now, fast forward, there is another convention that was created pursuant to the London Convention, and that's called the London Protocol. Okay, so in the 1990s, the parties to the London Convention drafted a new treaty that was more precautionary than the London Convention, more science-based, more restrictive in terms of what you could put in the world's oceans. And in 2013, they passed an amendment to the protocol, right, to regulate so-called marine geoengineering activities, right, which they defined in an extremely capacious sort of manner, right? And so essentially what it did was it established a new Annex 4 under the treaty, and it said any marine geoengineering activity that is included in Annex 4 is subject to risk assessment. It can only be done for scientific purposes. You can't sell carbon credits, right? So essentially it did the same thing as the London Convention did. The difference is that because this is an amendment to the convention as opposed to a resolution passed by the parties, it would be legally binding, right? So that's a big difference. Okay. Now, it's contemplated that the protocol will operate exclusively once all the parties to the convention have joined the protocol. Okay. Problem is that you've got a large number of countries that are parties to the convention that have never joined the protocol, right? So you have kind of a split regime at this point. Okay. That's one of the limitations of this approach. Another limitation is that this amendment does not come into force. It's not legally binding on the parties until 2/3 of the parties to the protocol have adopted it. Okay. There are 56 parties to this treaty, or 53 parties to this treaty. That means somewhere around 36 would have to adopt it before it become legally binding. To date, only 6 have, right? So this is not in force yet. Now, the parties have talked about provisionally applying it, right? Agreeing that they would all apply it until it comes legally into force. It's unclear whether that will ultimately happen, but that at least currently undercuts it. Another problem with this amendment is that there is one small country when it comes to marine CDR that is not a party to the London Protocol, and that, of course, is us, right? That's a pervasive theme. So if it's a U.S. flagged vessel, it's not going to be subject to the London Protocol under any circumstances whatsoever, right? Nor would any other, if you flagged your vessel in Vanuatu, quite frankly, it would not be subject to this protocol, right? So that's again a limitation in this case. Okay, but this is a pretty kinetic treaty when it comes to looking at these approaches. As I said, initially, they only listed one approach under Annex 4. That was ocean iron fertilization. But now, in 2023, the parties have said that they may want to add these two at the top, right? Ocean alkalinity enhancement and biomass cultivation for carbon removal. That would include macroalgae farming. There's also proposals to take large amounts of biomass from terrestrial regions where when that biomass, like crop residues or forests, ultimately decomposes, it releases that CO2, right, within a couple of years. The biomass sinking would be to bundle all that biomass together, dump it in the ocean, bury it at the bottom, and ultimately store the CO2 for long periods of time, right? So the parties are contemplating that they might want to regulate both of those, okay? And they've also said, they've recommended that this risk assessment framework should be applied even before this treaty's come into effect, anytime a country has a project of this nature, right? So that may be ultimately what we see. Second regime that has looked at this issue is the Convention on Biological Diversity, right? They also freaked out when it came to ocean iron fertilization. And so in 2010, they passed a resolution that looks very much like the resolution from the London Convention. It says you can only do it at a small scale, has to be for scientific purposes only, subject to risk assessment, okay? All good, okay? But there's limitations in terms of this also. First of all, again, these resolutions that they pass are not legally binding on the parties, okay? Problem one. Problem two is a small country that's engaged a lot in marine CDR is not a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity. That, of course, is us, right? So if these resolutions would not apply to any U.S. Vessels. And then third of all, quite frankly, the CBD has been pretty lousy in even meeting its core mission of arresting loss of biodiversity. So I'm skeptical that it's going to be able to take on something this esoteric and make a big difference. But nonetheless, it's involved. Okay, so last thing is, what are other regimes in the future that might have jurisdiction over this approach and might seek to regulate it? Okay, well, there's a couple of them that I think that would be applicable. One is obviously the Law of the Sea Convention, right? And the Law of the Sea Convention, on one hand, provides pretty broadly for a right to conduct marine scientific research, right? So if you're one of these companies and you want to conduct research on ocean alkalinity enhancement or iron fertilization or so forth, you can certainly climb out of these provisions that say that you have a right to scientific research, and indeed it's privileged, okay? On the other hand, there are limitations to it, right? If you're doing it in territorial seas of a country that's a party to the Law of the Sea Convention or in their exclusive economic zone, you are going to have to get permission from that country. You're also going to have to allow them to participate in those projects if you want, right? And that could be a major limitation, especially if you have lots of proprietary data that you don't want other folks to see, okay? In areas beyond the exclusive economic zone, again, there's a right to conduct marine scientific research. Some of these approaches would be privileged probably in the open oceans, and the Law of the Sea Convention would provide for the right to conduct that kind of research, but subject to some big limitations. One is Article 263 says that states and competent organizations are responsible for ensuring that marine scientific research, right, is done in a way that's responsible, and they can be liable if there's damages that occur as a consequence, right? And there's a negligence-based approach for this, right? So it doesn't mean that if a harm occurred, it would per se give rise to liability. But if it was deemed that you'd not done everything you could to minimize the risks of those approaches, and it created harms in fisheries, for example, or other contexts, that country that authorized it could be liable to others for damages, right? So that provides limitations. In terms of full-scale deployment, right? Article 194 talks about the need to prevent, reduce, and control marine pollution of the environment. And it defines marine pollution, right, as substances or energy, right, which result or are likely to result in deleterious effects, right? And so a lot of these things could be deemed to be pollutants, right, if they caused harm, right? Introduction of alkalinity, introduction of iron, introduction of macroalgae, right? And again, the regime provides for liability in all of these cases. It's also likely that the new biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction treaty that has just started being signed and likely will enter into force in the next couple of years could have a profound impact in terms of regulating marine carbon dioxide removal approaches. I think there's a couple of things that would be relevant. One would be the right to establish area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. It may be that the parties to the treaty would want to carve out areas where they would not want marine CDR approaches to occur as a consequence of potential threats, right, to ecosystems, fisheries, and so forth. Conversely, because some of these approaches, ocean alkalinity enhancement, for example, could actually reduce ocean acidification also, right? It may be that we want to privilege certain areas, right, in terms of marine CDR. And area-based management tools could help us to ultimately sort that out. The other provisions that would be most applicable are the obligation to conduct environmental impact assessments, right? So any of these approaches that could have impacts in the global commons or could have impacts in exclusive economic zones of other countries, right, would be subject to environmental impact assessment. And BBNJ is far more stringent when it comes to environmental impact assessment than the Law of the Sea Convention was. It provides more specific standards. It provides more precautionary standards to trigger the need for an environmental impact assessment, and it provides more scrutiny. It allows the scientific committee of the BBNJ, for example, to scrutinize any environmental impact assessment that a country, for example, would sign off on and opine on whether they think that EIA is adequate, right? In the end of the day, that country still gets to decide if the project proceeds, but that could put additional pressure on countries in terms of reacting. Okay. Finally, the other treaty that makes sense is the Paris Agreement, right? Because this is supposed to be a climate response. So one question would be, could you claim under your nationally determined contributions, your pledges to meet the Paris Agreement, that one of the ways you could do that is to erect MCDR projects, right? Well, you have to determine what you're allowed to do in terms of NDCs. Well, Article 4.2 says your NDCs are effectuated through, quote, pursuing domestic mitigation measures, right? So then you have to figure out as a lawyer, what's a mitigation measure, right? And despite the fact that that term's used 18 times in the Paris Agreement, it's not defined, okay? But Paris is part of the Framework Convention, and the Framework Convention, fortunately, does define it. It says mitigation is limiting emissions of greenhouse gases. Well, that's not what MCDR would do. And protecting and enhancing sinks and reservoirs, right? Things that take up CO2, right? So I think a good argument could be made that a country could claim as part of its NDCs that it's going to engage in marine carbon dioxide removal. And I suspect countries will start to do that in the future. Irrespective of whether they do that or not, I think there's provisions of Paris that would allow the parties to Paris to scrutinize these approaches and try to ensure that they don't have disproportionate impacts on vulnerable populations and so forth. Preambular language, the introductory language to the treaty, talks about ensuring the integrity of ecosystems, including oceans, protection of biodiversity, right? And it emphasizes that parties may be affected not only by climate change, but by the impacts of the measures taken in response to it, right? And so I think an argument could be made that the parties could look at these as response measures, right? And take into account the potential impacts that they have, right? There's other language that would allow that, right? It says, for example, that parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider obligations on human rights, right? And so to the extent that some of these approaches could have human rights impacts, whether they'd be negative, right, in terms of things like nutrient robbing, for example, or positive, right, in terms of addressing the impacts of unchecked climate change, right, which obviously has human rights implications. It would allow the parties to seek to balance those in a way that protects the most vulnerable. Now, this is preambular language to the treaty, right? And the preambular language to treaties, unless it's otherwise specified, is not legally binding on the parties, okay? But it provides guidance in terms of implementing the rest of the treaty, and so I think it would have some impact. And then lastly, in a lot of cases where these approaches are deployed coastally within exclusive economic zones, you're then going to have to look at domestic law, right? These are some examples in the United States of laws that might apply to these approaches. If you're going to use enhanced ocean alkalinity enhancement, you're going to have to mine minerals like wollastonite and olivine, right? And so mining laws, right, including safety issues, right, are going to be regulated under that. We implement the London Convention through something called the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, right? So we have a law to regulate putting materials into our coastal areas, right? And we have a permitting process for it. And any company that would want to do that within our coastal area would be subject to that, right? Clean Air Act could be applicable in terms of, again, mining minerals, Clean Water Act, Coastal Zoning Management Act, if it was something that was going to be done in an area with it where states have jurisdiction. National Environmental Policy Act for any major project would require an environmental impact assessment. And in some cases, if we were sequestering using pipelines, for example, including in the world's oceans, we have standards in the United States. And this would be true in other countries also. And countries such as Germany, for example, have already started trying to ascertain how they're going to regulate these kind of approaches. Okay. And so I'm going to stop there and simply say carbon removal is likely to be effectuated at a very large scale in the long term. It is likely that these ocean-based approaches, because of the capacity of the world's oceans, are going to be front and center, and they present some tremendous opportunities and at the same time, some tremendous risks. And the challenge we're going to have is ultimately assessing them quickly, and trying to balance equities in conditions of high uncertainty. Thank you very much.
Good. I don't know if people have questions. Do we have time for questions? People have time, maybe we take a couple and then we can. Okay.
Yeah.
One question. So you mentioned like when you do alkalinity carbon, there is this chromium nickel metals. So you mentioned that the levels of this were not too high. But was there an assessment on the food chain, like bioaccumulation, biomagnification?
Yeah. So first of all, remember, we're talking about a very small end of studies to date of this, right? So there's a company called Vesta that has been putting olivine on beaches in places like Long Island, right? And then assaying what happens in terms of the releases and monitoring things like heavy metals. Okay, that study has been 2 years to date. And one of the things that they have been trying to look at is issues of bioaccumulation, right? They still think that they're going to be below those critical thresholds. And so far they have been, but it's definitely an additional wrinkle to this. And you're going to need it in a lot more areas. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned that on marine and any type of geoengineering, you just have this risk management of what are the unintended consequences and even what are the known consequences and trade-offs. I'm just curious your thoughts personally, if you think we'll ever get to a point that not even that we'll get everyone to agree on how to value the different risks and how to make trade-offs, but we'll just be able to we know, or at least enough of the possible. I mean, you mentioned like we don't even know what this will do to some species, biodiversity, et cetera. Is there any end of studies that will get to a point that's this complex and this size? You're optimistic that we'll be able to say, here are all the possible risks of doing this option.
Yeah, I mean, you'll never know all the possible risks. You'll never be able to wholly assess those risks, right? That's true though with a lot of interventions, right, that we have. The problem that we have in this case is we would certainly learn a lot more if we had 30 or 40 years to assess these things, right? And if my generation and my parents' generation, right, hadn't messed the world up so much, we'd have the luxury of that, right? But we didn't, right? So those of you that are younger, you don't have to thank us, right? But the point is that we now believe that we need to deploy these things quickly, and that's part of the dilemma, right? We know unchecked climate change is catastrophic for ocean ecosystems, right? I teach ocean law and policy, and you know it's a disaster in the making. But the question is, when do we know enough about these approaches that we believe from a risk assessment perspective that it's okay, right? And the unknown risks are a difficult part of that, right? Because by definition, you can't feed that into that risk assessment approach. I think that a couple of these approaches are more likely to be benign than others. I don't think ocean iron fertilization really has a future. I think that that macroalgae could have some limited benefits and co-benefits, right? It can also benefit ecosystems in other ways, right? And I think ocean alkalinity enhancement potentially could have co-benefits in terms of ocean acidification that would help justify it. And we may be able to characterize the risks enough to think that it makes sense, right? I don't think upwelling is going to get us a whole lot. that's probably as close as we're going to get. We're likely to deploy a lot of these under high conditions of uncertainty, largely out of desperation, right? And that's, this falls under this broad category of climate geoengineering, right? And it's by no means the craziest stuff we're now thinking about, right? We're talking about putting huge amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight away, even though it might shut down the monsoon occasionally, because of the implications of unchecked climate change, right? That's just the marine geoengineering and geoengineering in general is just kind of a policy of despair, and that's where we are.
Thanks for such a great talk and a lot. So it sounds, I mean, based on the overview of technology, it sounds like not a lot of these are well founded yet. Is there any sort of direct water capture or like DAC equivalent in the oceans?
Yeah, they're talking about something called DOC, direct ocean capture, just like direct air capture. The problem with direct ocean capture so far is that it requires huge amounts of energy, right? And so that's a dilemma, because anything that requires huge amounts of energy, and this is true with direct air capture on land too, right? Then the question is, well, if you're using fossil fuels, right, to drive these systems, obviously that's going to be dumb, right? So you can't do that. So you're going to have to use renewables, right? So then the question is assuming you've got a limited amount of renewables, is that the optimal deployment of those renewables? Would it make more sense to directly use them to electrify everything as quickly as possible and then, move to this stuff? Or does it make sense to divert some of it, right? Proponents of this like to argue that there's unlimited amounts of renewable energy out there, right? But it's not true. Right. And so we do have to make those kind of assessments, and that's difficult also. And you started seeing places, the state of Washington, for example, when companies are proposing direct air capture in the state of Washington, they're stipulating that they cannot deploy that facility unless they can prove that they're creating a new source of renewable energy, right, to drive it. Right. So they can't take from the current electrons that are available in terms of renewables, right? So that's the issue right now with direct ocean capture, is it's high energy. I think some of the studies I've seen said it would take maybe 20% of our renewable energy supply to drive that system, right? Now that may make sense, right? We may decide ultimately that the drawdown we get justifies that kind of energy requirement, right? But that's the kind of decisions that we have to make. And again, we have to make a lot of those decisions under high conditions of uncertainty, right? But policy still must be made.
We are over time, so I'm gonna end the recording. But we're all, of course, welcome to continue this discussion in the Earth Commons office. We have lunch there, take food, we have extras here as well. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.